1 in every 4 people die climbing K2.
I've tried it twice and successfully summited once without bottled oxygen. Spent 40 hours in the death zone. I've never been more tired or exhausted or nearer my ultimate empty state. I don't know how much longer I would have had to survive. I had to write a will. You get on that plane when you're going on that trip, and I'll either come back with an incredible story, life-changing experience, or I might not be on the plane flight back.
Last year, the 2 American climbers
In a competition to become the first American woman to summit all 14 8,000-meter peaks on Shishapangma, 2 avalanches took 4 lives.
they both died.
Sadly, is part of the deal you're making when you climb those peaks. Getting to the top is optional and getting back is mandatory. I had my first injury on that mountain, dislocated my shoulder. I lost like 20 plus pounds. Your body just ends up cannibalizing itself. At high altitude, you lose your ability to see. They did MRIs of people who had been in the death zone, and they developed lesions on their brain. I am nothing more than a single, narrow, gasping lung floating over the mists and summits.
So let's get into it.
All right.
K2, the Savage Mountain.
Right.
1 in every 4 people die climbing K2. And you've done it once?
I've tried it twice and successfully summited once.
With oxygen?
No, without oxygen.
Without oxygen?
Without oxygen.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Everest?
Everest summited twice. I don't really count the first time because I did use oxygen in the last 500 meters. I mean, I stood on the top, but I am most proud of the second time I came back and did it in a more aesthetic and purist way, which was without the aid of supplemental oxygen.
Mm. And your Sherpa?
So I did climb with climbing partners. All the 8,000 meter peaks I've climbed have had sometimes European, Western partners, and sometimes Sherpas. And some of the time they used oxygen, some of the times they didn't. And so that was a choice for them on how they wanted to climb. But for me, I didn't want to use oxygen, and I wanted to climb the mountain as it lies rather than trying to bring the mountain down to me with something that disconnects you from that experience that we were talking about, the sublime experience, having a contraption on your mouth, pumping oxygen in and leaving you reliant on that equipment and disconnected from the kind of the delirious state of hypoxia and the true test of whether you can be up for the mountain as it lies. So yeah, it became important to me after my first expedition to the Himalayas. I resolved to never again use bottled oxygen. And so then I came back and did many more. And from then on, I never used it anymore.
So without oxygen, how long are you able to stay at the death zone or the zone of no return?
Right.
Which is how many feet and how many meters?
Yeah, so around 26,000 feet or somewhere around 8,000 meters and above. The human body just does not sustain itself permanently. You're on a ticking clock. You don't know exactly. It's different for every person. And today, the amount of time I would survive up there could be very different than it was. Let's see, the first time I did Everest without oxygen was 2016, so that's been a number of years past. I spent 40 hours in the death zone on that trip without oxygen, and actually had to sleep.
Which climb?
This was Everest in 2016.
Which climb was that for you in Everest?
It was number 2, and it was the time I did it without bottled oxygen. Spent 40 hours in the death zone that time, and I've never been more tired or exhausted or nearer my ultimate empty state than that trip. I don't know how much longer I would have had to survive, but I know I've never been more depleted or on empty from it. So everyone knows that you have a limited amount of time there. And for some people, they wouldn't be able to survive getting there. Other people could survive a long period of time, but it's a finite amount of time. It's not permanent. It does not sustain life up there. So when you're there, you're on borrowed time, and it's incredibly focusing in terms of your objective and your need to get ultimately away and back to lower elevations where human life is sustained. But spending those brief moments up there can be an incredible, almost drug-like experience, because you're operating with this oxygen shortage. Your blood oxygen saturation, even no matter how well acclimated you are, is severely low, much lower than what any doctor or paramedic would ever be happy about. And they would, if they found you on the side of the road and your blood oxygen was at the levels that it is permanently when you're up there without oxygen, it would be a major emergency. And yet that's what you have to deal with just to reach your objective. So it's a very interesting and mind-altering state, actually.
Did you hallucinate?
I did not hallucinate that I can recall. And that's the funny thing. The lack of oxygen impairs your memory. And so even when you're there, say you're in your camp, you're waiting and preparing for your summit push, you put all this effort into remembering where you place things. And I would be like, all right, I have my headlamp to my left, I have my water bottle to my right, my hat, my gloves. I'm going to take this short nap before we do the summit push. You wake up and you can't remember where you put that thing that you firmly try to fix in your memory. And it's just like, wow, okay, I'm in an alien environment right now. It's very surreal. And you can't even remember people's names that might be friends that you know frequently. And you're like, oh man, the fact that I can't remember that person's name, I'm definitely impaired.
Mm-hmm. Did you have like any near-death experiences on either of them? Because K2 is known as being the dangerous mountain, most dangerous mountain, right? Yeah. And why is that? Is that from avalanches, unpredicted weather? Is it the climb itself? Is it more tactical?
It's much more technical. So K2, the standard and easiest route on it is far more challenging from a technical basis than Everest and most of the other 8,000 meter peaks. There's a lot of rockfall and there's a lot of avalanches that are very unpredictable. Plus the weather can be very, very bad. So the year that I first went to Pakistan to attempt K2, the prior 2 years had either 0 summits or just 1 summit because of the unpredictability of the weather. And I think the 1 summit that did happen was very poor judgment. It was very dangerous conditions. Everyone else decided it was too dangerous and someone pushed on and they got lucky. And then one of my climbing partners from that trip had actually been on K2 in 2008 when there was a huge tragedy, and he had someone fall and slip off to their death just feet from him. So the steepness of the mountain, people walk outside of their tent, and if they trip, could go on a 1,000-foot ride. So it's it's just a much more serious mountain, and all of those factors, plus the fact that at that altitude, it's very easy to get pulmonary edema or cerebral edema, and it can be very hard to get out. And so if you're there for too long after getting one of those altitude sicknesses, you're again on a short ticking time clock.
And did you have any experience like that, like where were you with anyone who had a near that, like where someone had to get pulled out, or were you at the bottleneck and you saw someone? Or
so I was fortunate on K2 itself. Well, I turned around the first time. I was late for the summit window. I'd been on the peak next to it called Broad Peak, and someone was in a near-death experience there, and I happened to be in the right place in the right time to help him. So this was a guy who was a famous old school climber, and he had solo climbed. He left his companions, summited. On his way down, he had slipped and fallen and was out for multiple days, and people thought he was lost. In fact, his climbing partners had given him up for dead. And my climbing partner and I woke up at it was the high camp on Broad Peak, another 8,000 meter peak, and this other team was coming into camp, picked up their stuff, and they were going down, and we poked our head out of the tent and asked them what was up. And they're like, yeah, we were climbing up here. Our partner went and off on alone, and we haven't seen him come back. And they actually had decided that they had to give up on him. So they went down, and we were a little surprised. Seemed a little odd just to completely relegate him to the mountain after a couple days. But we got a call later that day on the radio saying someone had spotted him, and he was alive, and he was moving off trail way on the glacier. And we clearly knew that he needed help. So my partner and I were the ones that were closest at the time. Someone flew a drone up from base camp and actually was able to help guide us to him. We were able to go get him hydrated. He was hallucinating big time. When we got to him, he was like, yeah, every time I would lay down on my ice axe, I'd start sleeping, and I would start seeing Range Rovers and helicopters coming to pick me up. And then he'd wake up and nothing would be there. And so we helped him and got him down. Because of that, we were late for our summit attempt and had to turn around halfway up K2. But for myself, the big mountains that I've climbed, actually, I was better acclimated for the tallest ones, K2 and Everest. I would say that the most dangerous personal episode for me was climbing Cho-Yu, which was the 6th highest peak, also without oxygen, and we were trying to outrun a storm coming in. So I went up a lot faster than I normally would. I didn't have the acclimatization rotations, and I was on the summit ridge, and I was really close to turning around. I had one of those experiences where I was talking to another Italian climber that was climbing at the same time, and I tried to tell him, hey, I know this other Italian climber, good friend of mine, and the name just was blank in my mind. I couldn't drag it up, and I was just like, man, this is dangerous. And I would say my vision was affected. Things felt like a little bit blue, but we were really near the top and kept going. Made it down okay. One of the interesting side effects of all of this was I got spots in my vision from it because I had retinal hemorrhaging. I didn't notice it till I got down, and I see all these spots, and I found out that they resolve by themselves over time, but they happen to a lot of climbers at high altitude.
Is that from the sun, or is that from the oxygen?
It's just the lack of oxygen, the low pressure. Your retina bleeds, and the little blood spots end up clouding your vision. Luckily, they did go away. When I got back to New York, I saw an eye doctor, and you could see the spots. He took a picture of the back of my eyeball. So that was probably the time when, in retrospect, I think, man, that was maybe the most dangerous.
But why that time?
It was just because I was going much faster, and I didn't have as much time to acclimate. And I ended up, that was actually on my trip when I climbed Everest without oxygen. I climbed this other peak, Cho-Yu first, and that got me in the condition that Everest was actually easier for me after that, even though it was another, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000 feet taller. But by the time I rested when I came down and then went over to the Everest base camp and climbed that, I was really well acclimatized by then. And so I spent like an hour on the top of Everest without oxygen, and I was relatively fine.
An hour on the top?
Yeah. It was interesting. I talked to other people who had climbed it or were climbing it without oxygen, and their camp doctors told them you have 5 minutes at the top. You have to turn around. I didn't have a doctor telling me what I could or couldn't do, and I was separated from my climbing partner. I had gone ahead, and so I was just waiting up there. I was like, well, and the weather was kind of good for Everest. So I'm looking around. I mean, I was definitely in a little bit of a daze because at that altitude, you're not going to be like 100% there, but it was much, much better than on Cho-Yu. Now, I have turned around on other attempts. I think Cho-Yu was kind of like just like gray zone, whether I should have turned around or not. On my second attempt for K2, the second trip I went there, it took actually 2 attempts on that whole trip. In the first attempt, I made it up to about 8,000 meters, and I was just like, I'm not well enough acclimated. And so I turned around and came down, and then a couple weeks later, got another weather window and went for it, and then I was ready. So I've been really fortunate to never feel like I was super close to a near-death experience, and I hope that I continue to use good judgment, because it's never worth, like, as they say, getting to the top is optional and getting back is mandatory. So if you turn around, the mountain's still there, you can come back another time. Mm-hmm. It's not worth pushing through if your body or the mountain isn't ready.
What's harder, climbing up or climbing down?
It's way harder going up, but surprisingly coming down, or not, maybe it's not surprising, coming down is where most of the accidents happen, right? Because you've spent so much energy mentally and physically to get to the top. A lot of people don't have a reserve, and if they've pushed past their turnaround time, that's what you see in that movie Everest. All these people going past their turnaround time, get stranded up there. And
what movie, Everest?
The really famous one that was a true story, based on, I think, a tragedy in maybe '96, but it was based on the book Into Thin Air, and some incredibly famous climbers and guides. It's a heartbreaking story. So you see one of the most famous guides on Everest of all time talking on a satellite phone, being patched into his wife who's pregnant in Australia, and he's too far up the mountain for anyone to go help him, and no one knows
what happened though. Why is he stuck up there?
He stayed up there because a client wanted to keep pushing onto the top, and he didn't really have the heart to force them to turn around.
And he's a guide from Australia.
He was a guide. I think it was Scott Fisher. I need to check my names on that, but incredibly sad story, and the movie is profoundly moving.
Is it the movie? Is it pretty old? Pretty old film?
Yeah.
I think I saw that when I was younger.
Yeah,
and it was like it's like a horror film.
Yeah, but it's
someone falls down a one of the glaciers, or
it's
crevices.
It's a totally true story though. About
I think
a big tragedy.
I think that's why I've never had the. I think every parent should make their children watch that movie when they're to traumatize them to not doing
possibly it. But the weird thing is it might make some kids be like, yeah, that's what I want to do.
Yeah, not me. Have you ever thought about your parents when you're doing this?
Oh my God, yeah. This is one of the big challenges of having a something that's a part of your life that is so meaningful to you, and yet causes so much stress to the people who love you. Yeah. Because,
of course,
I have to say, dying on one of those mountains is probably like one of the better ways to go, if I had to pick. If you get, it's a beautiful place. I wouldn't mind that being a final resting place if it had to be. I obviously don't want to take any decisions that would lead to that happening, but it doesn't hurt for you as much as it hurts for the people you care about and that care about you. So that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges to making a decision to go on a climb with that kind of a death rate is the feeling of, is this just a selfish endeavor on my part that, putting your parents or grandparents or other loved ones through have you had
difficult conversations with them about it?
Absolutely. I think one of the hardest parts is because of this passion that developed for me, when I realized on a purely rational basis what the odds were in climbing those peaks without oxygen. I think climbing Everest is pretty safe if you are using oxygen. The death rate is pretty low, but it jumps up really dramatically if you're trying to do it without oxygen. And so you have to get your life in order before you go on a trip like that. So as a young man, I had to write a will and tell my parents where to find my bank accounts. And so you get on that plane when you're going on that trip, and you're like, this next month is going to be incredibly momentous, because I'll either come back with an incredible story, life-changing experience, or I might not be on the plane flight back. And that's very, very heavy. And you can't you can't ignore it and think it's going to go away. So you have to have those conversations with your loved ones, and it's pretty serious.
Yeah. Last year, the two American climbers, female American climbers, Gina and Anna, were racing they were in a competition. It was kind of a toxic competition to be the first females from America to climb how many peaks? It was
I think they were trying to be the first ones to climb all 14 8,000 meter peaks.
And they both died.
Yeah.
At the same time. Which
sadly is part of the deal you're making when you climb those peaks, that you can't, you try to reduce the risk as much as you can with good training and good decisions, but then there's a certain level of objective risk that you can't make go away. It's still going to be there.
And which mountain did they die on?
Shishapangma, which is one of the lowest of the 8,000 meter peaks, but definitely not one of the safest. And it's in Tibet, which is where I climbed both Cho-Yu and Everest both times. It's a very, very beautiful, remote place. There's very little chance of rescue on the Tibetan mountains. But that's a very sad outcome that happened to them, but definitely part of the deal that they made, whether they acknowledged it or not, in trying to go after those peaks.
Mm-hmm. So you can climb it from Tibet or where?
So Shishapangma is fully within Tibet. Everest is on the border of Tibet and Nepal. So most people have been climbing it from Nepal. I did it from Tibet, which I significantly prefer. But
why?
So there's different types of risk, and I preferred the risk profile on the Tibetan side. So on the Nepali side, there's this crevasse field that you have to go through that's incredibly random if something bad happens. And in the last 10 or so years, there were a couple really tragic accidents where there was an ice fall avalanche, killed many people. And that's due to this Khumbu ice fall that you have to travel through. That's very capricious. A crevasse could open, a huge serac of ice could collapse above and come crashing down. Whereas, but on the beneficial side, on Nepal, you do have helicopters that can come get you from pretty high camp. Whereas when I climbed from Tibet, there's no helicopter rescue, but there's no huge ice fall, no big crevasse field. And I also think it's more beautiful from the Tibetan side. So I preferred the type of risks that I had more chance of seeing them coming, which are more impactful on the northern side, the Tibetan side. What I mean by that is the main risk there would be from altitude sickness, getting high altitude pulmonary edema, high altitude cerebral edema, and those give you a little warning when they're coming. If you're coughing and you hear gurgling on your lungs, you have pulmonary edema and you need to turn around immediately. If you're have a stumble in your gait, they call it ataxia. If you have if you have those hallucinations, if you have a severe headache that's getting worse, there are signs for high altitude cerebral edema as well. And if you turn around immediately, you can generally get down and save yourself. Whereas on the Nepali side, a lot of those accidents came from purely random things that you can't predict coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tell us about Rainbow Valley up there. There's 200 bodies just stuck frozen where you can see their boots and their gear.
Yeah, it's really powerful when I think this...
You can see both the honor of Everest and the horror of Everest at the same time.
Exactly. it's very sobering seeing people along the trail that were just the same as you in some way. They thought that they could make it. They had prepared, they had trained really hard, and yet luck didn't fall their way. And in particular, there was a very famous climber on the northern route, which I took, called Green Boots.
Oh yeah.
He was in a cave. So that was Green Boots Cave. And this is on the ridge, the summit ridge, only a couple hours from the top on this Tibetan route. And going by him was almost a rite of passage and part of the pilgrimage. And it's a moment where people, for sure, myself going by, would pay homage as you go by and think of that person and think of how very similar they are to you. And it's a humbling moment where you respect the mountain more and you realize that your grasp on life is frail and fragile in that moment and helps you appreciate it. So in just the last few years, very unfortunately, I think the Chinese government took an expedition and moved his body out of that cave off to the side where people wouldn't see it. And to me, that deprived people of that respect that they could pay to him and his dream, which ended up there. But it's very sobering.
So how many have you seen at Everest?
On those, I think on Everest, I think I saw 6 or 7, and some of them were recent. And one of the members of my climb in 2016 was actually going back to, it was a family friend of his that had died the previous year, and he was right on the trail. And he went and removed the notebook from his pocket. And in that case, because it was less of a icon on the trail like Green Boots, he did move the body. It's too difficult at a certain altitude. A frozen body is nearly impossible to bring down. And so the most respectful thing there was just to move it off the trail. And I saw that body when I went up. It was moved on that trip by one of my climbing teammates. And it was a beautiful thing that he came back to do for the family. So yeah, that really keeps it top of mind for anyone who's climbing there, what decisions they've made, and hopefully helps them make good decisions after that. Realizing, I saw one woman getting short roped coming down. She had lost her vision. Sometimes at high altitude, you lose your ability to see, and it's temporary. Mm-hmm. And she was sobbing, and there was a Sherpa in front of her, a few feet, Sherpa behind, and they were on like a short leash, helping her find her way down. And that was another very sobering moment, because you could be in the fittest shape of your life and get up there and your body just doesn't react well to that altitude. It's mm-hmm. not really a indictment of your physical fitness. It's just you reacted poorly. And so it's a very, very humbling place, and humility is the right way to approach those big mountains. It's not a conquering exercise. No one ever conquers those mountains. Mountains allow you perhaps to make it if you're well prepared. But I strongly react against people who try to climb these and think that they conquered the mountain. That's just silly.
What are you fueling? What are you eating with? How are you?
So when you're up there,
are you eating in the base camps?
Yeah. The crazy thing is the main fueling that really helps you is all the fueling that you did in the training before you got there, because you lose your appetite at altitude. And even no matter how much I brought all this extra whey protein, antioxidants, supplements, extra like chocolate bars, all these things to help me. And one, totally lost the appetite. I tried to force that stuff down. The food quality, I mean, it's trekked in there. It's not the greatest. I did eat pure vegetarian, not vegan, but vegetarian diet up there. And I think the biggest benefit of that was I avoided getting food poisoning at altitude, and so many people get food poisoning. And I think part of that is from uncleanly like conditions, unhygienic conditions they'll literally take live animals up and slaughter them at the camp and prepare it right there. Or maybe the meat that they are bringing up is old and there's flies. And I had multiple climbing partners that had just absolutely horrible GI issues. And that just completely demolishes your fitness training. You become dehydrated just in the place where you don't want to be dehydrated. And adding that on top of the altitude is horrible. So I was lucky that I never got sick, but even still doing everything I could right, I lost like 20 plus pounds in the span of like 3 weeks on some of these expeditions, because your body just ends up cannibalizing itself. The easiest protein for it to get is from your own muscles. So you kind of go in and try to bulk up as much as you can, knowing that you're on this strange clock where your fitness is coming down and your weight and body composite, your muscle mass and your fitness is going down every day that you're up there, but your acclimatization is improving every day. And you have to perfectly time your summit attempt while you've gained enough acclimatization to be able to summit, but you haven't lost so much fitness that you're no longer, you spent like years of time training for this trip. And by the end of the trip, you're like half the muscle that you had when you came in. That's basically what it feels like. And what the pictures I have of myself after coming back, I'm taking months to regain my fitness that I lost in just a few weeks while I was up there. So it's a really weird balancing act of just trying to take in as many calories as you can, but you're definitely wasting away every day that you're at high altitude.
And you're eating whatever the Sherpas bring from Tibet?
Yeah. So obviously depending on where you are, but.
Or can you bring everything yourself? Like bottled water?
Yeah. You're melting water up
foods.
there. You're melting water from the ice. You boil water. It's usually still pretty dirty.
It's probably contaminated from all the poop. It's like 12,000 pounds of poop. Yeah. From thousands of people coming up.
And when you see the water, even after it's boiled, it's cloudy. There's stuff floating around in it. I would add chlorine tablets on top of the boiling just to be sure. That was probably also something that helped prevent me from getting.
So you're drinking chlorine water?
Yeah, absolutely. I would definitely take chlorine water over E. coli. Wow. So I would add that into my hot water bottle after it's been boiled, shake it up, leave it for 30 minutes, and then drink it. But it's pretty wild. There's like hairs floating around in there, and because the snow is dirty.
So the base camp, you have to climb from base. How many base camps are there?
So there's usually a primary base camp. Sometimes there's.
I thought you can just drive into the base camp.
You can on some places. So for Everest, on the Tibetan side, you can literally drive to base camp, which is around 18,000 feet. People don't spend a whole lot of time there. They spend much more of it up at something called Advanced Base Camp, which is a 13-mile hike in. And
so you need to be carrying, you can't carry water, obviously.
So you can't carry water. So you're melting all the water there. Food is brought in with porters, yaks. Every few days, there's a whole yak train that's hiking up and down, carrying all this new food and provisions for
13 miles.
13 miles. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
They might not do it all in one day.
How many yaks?
Could be like 30, 40 yaks. Like these yak like trains are going every day up and down on Everest. K2 is actually much more remote. K2 takes weeks. I don't know if I'd say weeks, but it could be a week from the end of the road on K2 is almost 60 miles from base camp. And so that's like a week of trekking to go in. So you know that the food, if people are serving you eggs at base camp, those eggs have been like just jostled around on the back of a yak for a long time before they got to you. So K2 is a far more remote place, but yeah, so melting the food quality just generally, I never went with any of these really expensive outfits, and they claim to have better food, but the average local kind of company that supports teams on these mountains, the food quality, like I eat whole grain foods here in New York, brown rice, whole wheat stuff. Now you're just eating what they give you up there, white bread, white rice. Luckily there's a lot of lentils normally, so you can have some whole grain, some unprocessed beans. It's definitely like the food quality on the expedition is way lower than what I'm eating while training here in sea level.
Hey everyone, I just want to interrupt for one moment and ask for your input. We're striving to make this channel even better and more valuable for all of you. So if you have any constructive feedback, suggestions, or questions I may have missed, please don't hesitate to share them below. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on whatever platform you stream the podcast. We really appreciate this because we have a goal of hitting 50 reviews by the end of the month. Your contribution won't go unnoticed. Thank you for listening, and now back to the interview. Back to how do you train? Back to your training in New York City.
Yeah.
How do you prepare, especially altitude train when you're at sea level?
Yes, it's actually a really fun challenge figuring out how to prepare with what you have here in sea level, big city. I'm pretty far away from big mountains. Now, if you live in Colorado, I would just climb mountains to train, but because I live in New York City, I have to do the best with what I have. So what I ended up doing, I have an aerobic fitness base that's built up from years of running, but around 4 to 6 months before any expedition, I'd pretty much stop running and start really focusing on much longer duration training intervals. Because when you're up on those big mountains, it doesn't matter. You're never pushing your heart rate super high, but you have to be able to go for hours on end. It could be like a 12-hour day or even longer on your summit day, and it's all like zone 2 or below. And your body has to just be able to go and go and go. So you need really strong fat burning metabolism. You can't be dependent on glucose burning metabolism. So what I did was I would start hiking my building. I live in a 40-story building. I'd start hiking the building with a backpack on, up the stairs, and ride the elevator down, put a towel at the top with a water bottle, and I'd listen to books or podcasts for hours at a time. Sometimes I would do 10 to 12,000 vertical feet of elevation gain, hiking my building over and over and over again.
How many days a week?
Soaked. I would probably do that 3 to 4 days a week. And then I would alternate with weightlifting just to build more muscle mass. Cause like I was saying about your body cannibalizing itself, I just wanted to go in with excess body mass that my body could consume when I was there.
So you're wearing a ruck?
So I'm wearing a backpack, just one of my regular mountaineering backpacks, and I would throw water bottles or dumbbells in there and gradually increase the weight I was carrying. So at first I might be doing 10 pounds. By the end, I would be doing 30, 40 pounds and doing that for 4 hours. And I also go to there's a climbing gym here in New York that has a treadmill that goes to 30% incline. So twice as steep as most treadmills. 15% is fine too.
Mine goes 15.
15 is all right. But I like the 30% because it's a lot more like climbing a mountain. And I'd do that for hours as well. And
I'm trying to imagine 30. It's like,
dude, it's so
like
steep.
this.
Yeah, it's definitely not vertical, but it looks, it's 30 from the ground. So it's probably like, it's kind of like that. And it is actually pretty similar to the steepness of much of those hikes. Obviously parts of them go steeper, but it's perfect training. And at first it felt very challenging mentally to get through 3 hours of that. But after a while I would get into this crazy zone and I would crank through books or podcasts. Sometimes I'd crank through shows on an iPad and I'd have a pile of towels I'd be soaked in sweat and I'd build up a pile of the towels. So it was a really crazy thing when you get off that and you're completely soaked, you're wearing this backpack, or when you're riding the elevator down in your building, people are looking at you like, what is wrong with this person? That's all right.
Love that. And what books would you listen to? What podcasts?
Oh man. So this is a great thing when you're, it's like the stairwell in my building is like sensory deprivation chamber. It's just concrete, but I'd go into these like deep like zones where I'd be listening to books. And I think that was actually one of the things I liked most about being focused on a big goal like one of these expeditions is it would force me in my whole life to simplify, cut out a lot of other things, and live this more like monastic life. And I'd listen to these books. So I'd get both physical training while I was working out, but also mental training. So I didn't feel like I was wasting the time mentally. And I'd listen to books like Atomic Habits or Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday, The Obstacle is the Way, all these books that are just like really motivating for the task that you're trying to go after. Another one I really liked was The Evolution of Everything, just very explanatory about the world we live in by Matt Ridley. One book that it was a novel. I listened to mostly nonfiction, but The Martian is an incredible book because you really felt you paralleled, like you're trying to go into this place. It's super alien, very hostile to human life. This guy was on Mars after he'd been abandoned by his team for a long time, trying to find ways to survive and just human ingenuity to the ultimate maximum. So I found that like super kind of meta with what I was trying to go after and very inspiring because you're like, well, man, if that guy found a way and never gave up, if I'm put in a similar situation on K2, somewhere in the depths of Pakistan, that's the same approach that I need to take, same mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. The Martian. And how do you recover when you get back?
Man, it's so crazy. When I came back.
Well, okay. So
yeah.
When you're finished with Everest or you're finished with K2, where do you go to? Do you go to a nice hotel and go to a spa for a few days?
Just came straight back to New York.
Like after Burning Man, I go straight to Vegas and check into the Wynn Spa. Is that how you do it?
That would be the way. But while living here in New York and trying to climb these mountains, I'm an amateur at this. It's not my profession. So I would have to beg for time off from my office job. And asking for 5 weeks off for an expedition, especially my earlier career was in finance, they don't normally let you take that much time off. So here I am asking for the most time they've ever given somebody off to go do this, personal pursuit. I would come back and come absolutely straight back to work. I'd maybe fly in on Sunday and I would be at the office on Monday, and I would be so gaunt and so crazy looking. I would keep my expedition beard for a day just so everyone could see how crazy I looked. And then I'd be back to it. But I remember for like 2 or 3 weeks after that, I would be so famished. I would be eating 5 times a day, adding peanut butter to every cereal, putting a yogurt on top of the peanut butter. I would be eating so much that my stomach felt sick, but my body was still hungry. Just because it was so depleting. It was absolutely crazy. And then gradually you kind of come back and the weight bounces back, but it's not your same fitness. You become like skinny fat initially because you put on, you bounce back, it's not muscle. And then you spend another like 5-6 months trying to regain the fitness that you lost. So it's incredibly like depleting on the body. And I'm sure that over time.
And on the brain.
Oh yeah, on the brain. I'm sure I killed a lot of brain cells from these trips, unfortunately, and hopefully I'm okay because of it.
We got to throw you in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber for 2 months.
Yeah, for sure.
1 hour a day for 2 months.
Yeah. There's an interesting study I saw that they did MRIs of people who had been in the death zone and they developed lesions on their brain, even if they were using oxygen. So it wasn't only people who were truly up there, fully exposed to the lack of oxygen. Even with supplemental oxygen, they were damaging their brain. I want to go to one of those countries where you can pay for a cheap MRI, Mexico or actually Nepal. You can get MRIs off the street and it's much cheaper than here in the US. I want to get the highest resolution I can of my brain and see if I still have any of that. I'm very curious. But I actually noticed a cognitive, I would be in a little bit of a fog cognitively for a couple of weeks after some of those trips. And I think it's just from that exposure or lack of oxygen for a sustained period of time. And luckily I felt like the sharpness come back, but it's kind of scary when you come back and your verbal recall is a little bit slower, and you're like, oh man, that was heavy.
Yeah. I wonder if you can get a sleep oxygen mask to sleep with afterwards or something in your apartment.
Yeah, probably. And I think the hyperbaric thing could be interesting, but
then you'd have to go and there's one in Midtown because the ones here, they only have soft shells.
Right.
So you want a hard shell because it's 2%
for higher
oxygen.
Higher comp.
The other ones are 1.2.
So your earlier question though about how I trained for the altitude, I explained how I trained for like the physical fitness. I have a altitude tent from Hypoxico, and it's basically the reverse of, it's normal pressure, but the machine strips out oxygen molecules and then pumps in air with lower oxygen content. And I did that for the first few expeditions and I would end up gradually adjusting up the altitude, the effective altitude, until I was sleeping at like 18,000 simulated.
So tell me how that works.
So
it covers your whole bed?
Yeah, it covers the whole bed.
It's a tent that covers the bed.
It's a tent that covers the bed. It's kind of clear plastic so you can see out of it, but it keeps the outside air out. And then you have a hose coming from this machine. Company's called Hypoxico. A lot of people train with it, athletes, other people. That's pumping air in constantly.
So you're training at altitude. You're training at sea level, sleeping at altitude.
Sleeping at altitude. It would be way better to just be sleeping in Colorado at a high altitude. But this is a training method that you can use if you're at sea level. Now, the thing is, you're only in there for like 8 hours a day maximum. And then the rest of the day, you're at sea level. And the real gains from altitude exposure are come from consistent exposure. And so, yes, I think it helped a little bit. But what I ended up...
Did it increase your hematocrit?
I did get some blood tests done in one of the first years. And the tests were... It was hard to tell if it made a measurable impact. It made me feel better when I first got to true altitude. But it interferes with the sleep quality. So now you're not recovering as well from the training. And I ended up finding out that I could acclimate pretty fast when I got actually to the country. And so in the most recent expeditions I've done, I've trained on like a treadmill or a cycle with the mask on, but I haven't slept with it on because I wanted to get the best sleep I could for optimal recovery. And be just focused purely on fitness when I was here at sea level, and then just give myself enough time when I got to the country to let my body.
You train like on a stair climber, or?
Yeah, I would drag the machine with a mask down to the gym in my building, and I would get on like a Peloton.
Scare everyone.
Oh yeah,
gym.
I'm just like.
And so you have to hold it on, or is
it straps around?
It straps around, and then
I'll send you some.
You're just sweating
pics.
in a mask.
Yeah, you're sweating it, and when you peel and you can check your blood oxygen while you're doing it to confirm that it's working. And I would be able to get my saturation down to like 70%, and I would crank it up to say 12,000 feet, do a hard hour on the Peloton, be like totally in this hypoxic state. When you peel it off and you look around the room, everything looks a little bit bluish, like it tinges your vision for a little bit, and then all of a sudden the oxygen feels so good when you like peel off the mask.
I wonder if it's increasing your hematocrit.
That should.
Yeah.
Your overall blood oxygen carrying capacity is being stimulated from that. It's just a question of, is that a big enough stimulus, doing 1 or 2 hour training sessions with that? I just found that I preferred sleeping at sea level, full oxygen, recover really well. And then when I get to Pakistan or Tibet, I'm going to be there at altitude 24/7. And then I'm going to be focused on acclimatization, and I'll shift away from the fitness stuff. So that's what worked for me. But I know a lot of people that are very, very dedicated about the hypoxic tents, and they use them to shorten their expeditions dramatically.
Otherwise, you're there how much longer than them?
It's hard to compare one person with the next because each person can acclimate faster. I did all of my trips really fast, right on the bleeding edge, I think, of what's possible. I had, for the Everest Without Oxygen trip, I got to base camp on the first peak, Cho-Yu, on like May 3rd, and I summited Everest, I think, May 23rd. So it was basically 3 weeks time from.
What are you doing when you're there at base camp?
So most of it is rest, but you
just
eat,
in a sleeping bag in a tent.
Sleeping bag. You walk around.
Is there Wi-Fi?
I much prefer when there's no Wi-Fi, because you get more rest. But if the Wi-Fi is available, you can't resist it. So it's actually one of the things I love the most about these trips is
Starlink.
The simplicity.
Yeah.
No, no Starlink. The simplicity of living and the detox you can get from this constant like tension, like economy lifestyle that we're in. And if you have Wi-Fi, you're definitely going to be using it and checking social media and all this. But on most of my trips, I didn't have Wi-Fi. And so all I had was a little satellite communicator where I could send a text out to my family. No news, no email. Like, I didn't know what was happening in the world. And to have a couple weeks completely disconnected, like almost completely disconnected like that, was the most restful thing I've ever experienced. It's just incredible. So yeah, when you're at base camp or higher camps on the mountain, life is really simple. And all you have to really decide each day is, you have to figure out your food and water. You have to make sure you're warm and dry, and you have to decide if you're going up or down or if you're staying there. So life gets dramatically, everything else gets swept aside, and it's just these pure basic necessities. And then you're living in the moment and you're looking around, and that is part of that incredible spiritual experience, I think. Now, in recent years, every year that I go back, there's more Wi-Fi, there's more like cell phone coverage, and while you're glad, part of you is glad because I'm addicted, obviously, to my phone, and if I can connect, I'm going to be connected. But I'm also sad because I really appreciate that forced disconnection that I have had on these peaks.
Next time, just don't bring your phone.
Yeah, right.
Just bring one of those flip phones you can text your mom.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Well, you do
just
need.
Bring a lot of books.
Yeah. Bring the books. I need the.
Well, not. I guess you don't want to carry the books, right?
Yeah. So I bring the phone because it has audio books on it. If I want to
MP3 player.
Yeah, exactly. Truly old school.
How do you see the future of climbing evolving? Obviously, more Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Starlink.
Right.
A lot of tourists, social media.
Yeah.
Do you think, because of social media, people just want that badge of honor, that the clout, or
for those?
Do you think it's wrecking? Do you think it's wrecking the mountain? Do you think there's going to be laws passed by China or Tibet?
Right.
What do you think? What's
So it's so interesting. Like the really big peaks like Everest get all the attention and a few others. And then there's like this vast, just whole mountain ranges of mountains that don't get that same attention. And you have to say, yeah, it's because the average person has heard about those big names, and they're partly drawn by the people are drawn to the mountains for a lot of different reasons. Some of the time it's for the beauty, for the personal challenge. There's absolutely people on those mountains that are drawn for just purely egotistical reasons, or the conquering mentality that I talked about that I find so distasteful. Mm-hmm. The thing is, these economies in some of these countries are completely supported by tourists, and many of those tourists are coming in to trek. And so while Nepal has passed year after year after year new laws to prevent the supposed intent is to prevent the tragedy, from happening next year that happened this year, they don't really get enforced. Things like requiring people who climb Everest to have climbed another big mountain before. And so sadly, you do get a mountain full of people who are not very fit, not very experienced at that altitude and are completely dependent on oxygen, help from other people, Sherpas. And it's just the economics of it mean that they can't really say no. But it is really sad to see those mountains with those huge long lines of people going up, or watch documentaries. I saw a documentary on Everest just recently. It was a pretty recent one, and hearing about the tragedy of people who were deeply inexperienced and passing away on the mountain in totally preventable, deaths, totally preventable deaths. But the thing is, who am I to tell somebody that they can't go after their dream or their desire? And so while I find it sad to see the mountain filled with people who are a risk to themselves or to others, all I can say is I want people, when they do climb, to take care of the mountain and respect it and clean up after themselves. And climbing is a very personal pursuit. If someone wants to take the risk on, that is ultimately their decision. But my opinion is that, yeah, there's a lot of people climbing those mountains that that probably shouldn't be there. Just it draws all types. And what I hope is that more people get inspired by the beauty of the mountains, the challenge that they can find in them, and it's less about trying to add a line to their resume or something to brag about. And that's why I firmly believe that there's no like record chasing, trying to be the first to climb something, trying to be the fastest. If you're comparing with other people, to me, that's not what the mountain is about. It should be a comparison or test for yourself, and a place for you to experience some raw, pure living in its most like beautiful, unadulterated, and like unfiltered nature. That does come with risk, but when you come in unprepared, like a lot of people who feel like tourists, sadly, the mountain seems to defend itself in a way, and you see a lot of tragedies because of that.
Yeah. What inspired you to start climbing?
Well, I grew
originally?
I grew up in Colorado and did all of my childhood growing up outdoors. I lived right next to National Forest, climbed a lot of mountains growing up. I actually didn't think that climbing these big mountains was something I could do. But when I look back, I realized the seeds were planted at a very early age, and I just didn't realize it. I had some family friends that did development work in Nepal, and they sent back a postcard of Everest. And I remember, I still have the postcard. And I remember looking at it as a kid, I was probably 12 years old, and thinking I could never climb that, but that'd be pretty cool. And that was on my dresser for years. And then I went to the mountain shop, and I bought it in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I bought this poster, this beautiful picture of K2 with alpenglow. So it was like more a sunset or sunrise, pink because of like the early morning light, just incredibly beautiful. And I had that on my wall for many years. And then randomly, I had a bike that was, the name of the bike was Karakoram. And it's just like all these weird things where.
What's Karakoram?
Karakoram was the name of the mountain range in Pakistan. And so these like things were like in the background of my mind. And then completely randomly, I was on a hike with my dad in Colorado, Christmas Eve, one year. And we ran into a guy who had spent 7 or 8 years in Pakistan attempting K2. And there's even a Netflix documentary about it called K2 Siren of the Himalayas that features him. And I could see like this guy had that faraway look in his eyes, like that 1,000-mile stare. He had seen these big mountains, and he knew what he was talking about. And my dad and I were hiking with him, and I started talking to him, and I ended up getting his contact info. And literally on the drive back down from that hike that Christmas Eve, the wheels started turning in my mind, and I realized, wow, maybe I could climb a bigger mountain if this guy like gave me some advice and mentored me. And I ended up calling him, and that just set things in motion. And I decided to keep taking the next step. And that led to me going on my first trip to the Himalayas and just finding out what I could do. And so I never expected this passion it was not something I started out early on in life knowing that I wanted to do, but it unfolded in front of me and I decided to keep taking the next step. And it's been just this incredible, it's just so hard when people ask you, why do you climb? And it's like all these different things that we've talked about. It's the beauty of the mountains. It's that simple living that strips all the like complexities of daily life away and gives you like true deep rest in your soul. It's the preparation. I love that months of time preparing and feeling this gradual building, and the way that clarifies your life and priorities on the way, the preparation is as much fun as the actual trip.
Mm-hmm.
And then the mountain itself, to me, they're just fantastically beautiful. But I think the mountain, when you're there, it also reveals the character that you've built elsewhere. Like, do you put other people first? Or do you step over them? That stuff happens on a daily basis on those big mountains. Someone is in need. Maybe it's someone who doesn't deserve to be there. They shouldn't have made that choice. But now that they're there, what's your duty as a fellow climber? Are you going to move on, or are you going to help them? And I was very fortunate. People helped me a couple times. One guy shared a tent with me. Another guy gave me a bottle of water that took him an hour to melt because there was no stove in my tent when I had come back to it high on Everest. And I resolved after that it wasn't a change, but it really impressed on me. I want to be like these guys were to me if I'm ever in that same position. And I think I had those opportunities where that test came later. So it's a character development experience. And then I think my favorite quote of all about climbing is one I heard from Reinhold Messner, the first guy who climbed Everest without oxygen. And he said, we don't climb for the summit. The summit is just the turnaround point. We climb for the rebirth experience we have when we get back to base camp. When I first heard him say that, I just about jumped out of my chair. I was like, wow, that's true. There's this incredible, profound experience of going and facing who you really are in an austere environment where the mountain doesn't care, but it's beautiful. And you find out about yourself and you come back and you're a different person.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are some of the reasons why I got into it and still love it. And hopefully I have a few more big mountains in me. Knock on wood.
Yeah. Do you?
I think so.
I mean, have you thought about any more?
Yeah. Well, if it was hard taking 5 weeks off from my finance job before, now I'm at a startup, and startup feels like 3 months in like 3 days. It's just like crazy. So being away for a long period of time. So I try to compress my trips even more. Last fall, I went and climbed Ama Dablam in Nepal, which is one of the most beautiful peaks. It's not mega tall, but it's just incredibly perfectly symmetrical. It's one of the, I think, most photogenic peaks in the world. Had my first injury on that mountain, dislocated my shoulder, and part of the price you pay for climbing in the mountains long enough. Still been incredibly lucky with not being injured on as many trips as I've been. And then there's a few more big routes that I think would be incredible challenges for me. And it may be another couple years before I can get the time off to do them. So I'm focused more on smaller, more technical things in the meantime. But I think I do have there is a very interesting route that I have in mind. So we'll see.
You don't want to talk about it?
You don't want to put it out there. But there's a few unclimbed things left on the tallest peaks in the world.
Unclimbed routes?
Unclimbed routes that would be just a true, master test of, I'm not even up to the challenge right now in terms of technical ability, but I think in a couple of years of continued, training and practice, I could be. I think I have the fitness for them, and then you just have to get lucky with conditions. So we'll see before I'm too old for these pursuits. I definitely want to go after one or two more big things.
Like, would you be climbing with your hands, or would you be having to?
Yeah, ice axes, it'd be
rope.
It'd be ropes. It'd be considered mixed climbing, so mixed ice and rock, but at extreme altitude. And so it's just this full spectrum of you have to bring every capability in the toolkit. Has to be very, very, very good. But even still, there's a reason things haven't been climbed. So a few big things. But to me, whether I'm climbing a mountain in the Himalayas or going and reclimbing a 14er in Colorado, or one of my favorite places in the world is Chamonix in France. There's Mont Blanc there, and it's just the most spectacular. Like
a few times.
And just being in those places, that these are the trips. I've attempted Denali twice, had bad weather each time. I was up on Denali last year, and just like that same experience of simple living. My buddy Ben Stone and I, who you've met, were stuck in a campsite with a snowstorm for a whole week, and everything was as perfect as it could have been. You're just every day shovel out the tent, make sure the snow isn't collapsing on us, make some big bowls of mashed potatoes. It's the best tasting meal you've ever had in your life. Some reconstituted dry mashed potato flakes with a little block of cheese you put in, some ramen. Life is so simple and so perfect in those like trips that even if I can't take a 5-week trip and go to the Himalayas, take a 1-week trip and go to Alaska, or take a week and go to Chamonix and climb some mountains there. So it's a part of my life. I love those big mountains. I love challenging myself on the really high ones. I'm a little bit addicted to that lack of oxygen, but the same beautiful experience can be found on much closer peaks to home as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're in Alaska.
So Denali is the tallest peak in the northern, I guess, U.S., Canada, hemisphere. And that's Denali National Park. It's a couple hours from Anchorage. So that's that mountain has foiled me a couple times. And so
you were there with Ben?
With Ben, yeah, our mutual friend, Ben Stone, was there last year. And then last I was there in 2014.
I didn't know he was a climber, just a skier.
Yeah, he's an amazing climber.
Oh, wow.
Really, really good. And a great buddy to have along on a trip like that, getting stuck in a snowstorm. So, there are definitely more peaks. We'll see about the big ones, but climbing and being in the mountains is a way of life, and you can keep doing it for many, many, many years.
Who's your favorite mountaineer?
So what I admire is people who climb the mountains in what I would call good style. So leaving the least impact, doing it the most on their own with the least kind of external support. I think you have to think about this guy Reinhold Messner as one of the most ultimate badass adventurers of the last century.
Is he still alive?
Still alive. First
Where's
guy.
he from?
He's from Germany. First guy, or maybe Austria. First guy to climb Everest without oxygen. Before he did it, people thought it was humanly impossible. He has the greatest quote when he recalls being on the top. He said something like, "I am become nothing more than a single gasping lung." Oh God, I gotta find this. This quote is so good. It's definitely another favorite of mine from him. This was after his first ascent of Everest without oxygen. Nobody thought it was humanly possible. They thought everyone would just die. but he went out and tried it and proved it wasn't, that it was possible. He said, "I am nothing more than a single narrow gasping lung floating over the mists and summits." And that's just such a perfect encapsulation of this ethereal, surreal, like otherworldly experience. When you're at that altitude, if you were at an airplane and it decompressed, people would pass out in 90 seconds. And yet, if you give yourself enough time, some humans like Reinhold Messner can survive and actually stay alive and thrive up there and make it down in one piece. And luckily I made it as well. But yeah, so I think he's one of the most ultimate role models of climbing in a very purist way. I
love that.
He did it solo. I haven't climbed my mountains solo. So he did it solo without oxygen, without any kind of aid of any kind. So it's probably the most ultimate. But there are many others who climb in great style. I love that movie, The Alpinist, is it Leclerc is his last name. It's a very sad tragedy how he died, but he again climbed purely for himself. He wasn't climbing for external recognition, awards. The film crew had to chase him to stay with him. He wasn't trying to do it about himself. And yet the natural intrinsic value of climbing and being in the mountains was enough. And that's all that mattered for him. And he climbed in a very pure style. So those are people that I admire and respect deeply in the way they approach the mountains.
Well, I love that. Beautiful. Well, want to end here? Do you have anything else to say? That's pretty amazing.
I think we covered some good stuff.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, hopefully we can climb one day.
Yeah, man.